Sample, we're going to do the flounce sample, and you have two parts for that. You have A, which will be the base that your flounce will be attached to, and B, which is your flounce, which has the original length, which would have been here, divided into panels, and then each panel is slashed, not quite all the way, but almost all the way, and then opened at even amounts to get the flounce shape. If you want something to be really flouncy, like really drapey, you would do these spreads really wide. But you have to do it wide enough so that you can actually still cut out the pattern piece out of fabric. So that's one thing you need to consider. So if you don't remember, flounce is like a ruffle finish on the bottom of a hemline, or it could be at the top of something, and it has no gathers where it is attached. So for us, we only need a single layer of fabric, as we're only cutting one for each one. And I've got these photocopied pattern pieces for you. The photocopier did cut off the corner here and a little bit here. So when you cut it out, make sure you cut this into a corner. So just continue cutting here and along here so you get the corner shape, because that's important to have that little bit filled in for when we do our hem. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out now. Actually, before I cut it out, I wanted to point out a couple things. So my selvage is here. My grain line of my flounce is parallel to my selvage, of course, or it could be perpendicular. So this grain line here is perpendicular, which means it's a right angle to the selvage. Another really important thing is think about your fabric wastage. So you can see how I've tried to squeeze these two in as close as I can, still having the grain line in the right position. So I'm trying to avoid my wastage. That's really important. So I've cut out my pattern pieces. The next thing I need to do is I need to cut my notches. So this dark area here is the seam allowance, and you can see there's a little T there, which is the notch, and we just snip the length of that T. If you cut any further, you risk forming a hole. So if you cut past your seam allowance or even 3/4, your notch could end up fraying and causing a hole there. So it's really important when you cut your notches. Here we have two as well, which will line up with the two on piece A, that you just snip the length of the T. So to begin with, we're going to take our flounce, which is this part, and we're going to hem the bottom. So we're going to hem this larger curve on the bottom of our flounce. Now, anytime you do a hem, you do it with the wrong side of the fabric. Now with calico, we can't tell. It has no wrong or right side. Facing up, and your hem gets turned up towards the wrong side. Now for us, we're going to do a narrow double rolled hem. Now a narrow double rolled hem is the best hem finish for something that is cut on the curve like this. It's pretty much the best hem finish you can do for this type of thing. So any flounces that are cut on with lots of curves that run across the grain line, a narrow double rolled hem is the best. It's probably also one of the hardest hem finishes, but it looks the best. So if you master it, it's a very nice and high quality finish. So for us, our seam allowance is 1 centimeter, but as I said, it's double rolled. So what that means is there's 1 roll and 2 rolls like that. So for us, each roll, it has to be 1/2 centimeter. So I've got my seam gauge ruler here. So each roll I'm going to stitch is going to be that wide. You can have a seam gauge ruler handy just to check as you go along, or you could just go by eye. Probably best to check it at first and then try and just keep that width consistent. See there, that fold, I've got my 1/2 centimetre. So with the narrow double rolled hem, you do 2 stitch lines, 2 folds and 2 stitch lines. First stitch line is on the fold, and you stop and finger press your hem up as you go around, and then it gets folded up, and then you do the second stitch line, but I'll show you as we go. So I'm going to start lining up the groove in the middle of my foot really close to the fold. And I'm going to use my tails at the back to get my work started, to pull it through, and just to do a little reverse, and then I can go. So I use my fingertips and I finger press, and I can check my width, yep, 1/2 centimetre, and stitch really close to that fold. Stop, finger press, check, yep, good, and stitch. So I'm pretty confident with my eye. So what I mean by that is I can tell the measurement is pretty close to what it needs to be. A good way of doing it is you just see what you folded up before and make sure what you fold continuing on from that point is the same width. So stop, finger press, and keep going. Now it's really important to get that stitch line as close as you can to the fold, and you'll see why when we do our second stitch line. If you want, you can always stop and double check. Yep, 1/2 centimetre. Keep going. And we're going to continue this right to the end of our flounce and finish with a very small reverse stitch. When you're doing something fine like this, you'll find the machine doesn't really want to reverse a lot. So 1 or 2 stitches in the reverse stitch is adequate, that's fine. See, that's 1, 2 stitches. Take up lever up. So you can see my stitch line is really close to that fold. And then we can move on and finish our hem. So the next step, we're going to fold up another roll using the raw edge as our guide, and then finger press it so it's nice and narrow, and you're going to stitch on top of that stitch line you've created. And that's your guide. So all you have to do is fold it so you're folding up the same width as you did before, and you're stitching on top of that stitch line. Alright, so I'm going to continue sewing that, and then we'll move on. Okay, so that is my hem finished. It's a very narrow finish. This is the wrong side, so you can see that you've got 2 stitch lines there, whereas on the right side of the fabric it's just a nice bit of fluff, narrow finish for a curve. So we're going to move on to the next part, which is attaching our flounce to our base fabric, which could be the bottom of a skirt, could be a top, could be anything. So we have our notches that we marked before. We have one here, and we should have one here. And what should happen is when you put these 2 together, got to make sure it's going the right way. They should line up as you can see there, that those two line up. Now this top layer, because it is a curve, you may have to stretch it a little bit to get it to fit. Have a check. Yep, you can see with a little bit of stretching of that flounce. We can stretch it because it's not cut on the grain, it's cut against it. We can line up those notches. So back to your machine. Centimetre seam allowance. We're going to stitch with our flounce on top, right sides facing. We know these are the right sides because that is the right side of the hem finish. That is the wrong side. Doesn't really matter, but just need to make sure your notches match up. And what I'm going to do, let's bring that back. I've started with a little reverse, and then I'm going to line up these two notches, pinch them together, and pull my fabric so my raw edges line up, and then I can stitch my seam. Stop, just check that they're lining up. You see there. And stitch using your 1 centimetre guideline. Now we're going to readjust, match up our next two notches, pinch it together at that point. You see here, you really have to give that a stretch to get them to match up. So you are sewing a curve against something straight, so that's why you need to pull the fabric together to get them to fit and line up. Just readjust. You can pin the notches if you want to. That's up to you. I prefer not to pin. Make sure that top layer is flat. And then we finish by matching up our ends, giving it a pull, making sure it's flat, and continuing to stitch our seam. Reverse. And cut your threads. Now to get this flounce to sit better, once it is overlocked and ironed, we're going to snip just the flounce layer so it can open up that seam allowance and allow it to sit a little bit flatter. You can see this section here, because it's been cut on a curve, when I pull that straight, those snips I've made will open up and allow that seam to sit a bit flatter. Otherwise, you can see here that it wants to pucker this under layer, whereas it's not happening on this side because I've snipped into the flounce seam allowance. So be careful not to cut all the way. And you're just doing the layer of the flounce. So that should sit flat now. Now what you're going to do is you're going to overlock this edge. So I've overlocked the seam allowance with the flounce facing up. And then our next step, our final step, is to iron that seam allowance upwards. So we'll go do that. So I have my flounce here. Now what I need to do is iron that seam allowance up. So what you can do to do it is you can follow the flounce's curve and then just gently iron the seam allowance up, pulling the top to make sure it's open. So it's nice and flat and open. So again, follow the shape of the flounce around, gently pulling the top to ensure it is nice and flat and open. And then I'm going to come back on this side and then just iron that nice and flat. So there you have your finished flounce. Now if you wanted this to be drapier, you just do your slash and spread lines further apart.